Our next area of study concerns Schoenberg. At this time in Schoenberg's life, he is moving towards a rediscovery of his Jewish roots. I think it's very interesting that so many of the events that we've read about tend to be reactions to other events. So you have a problem or an opinion and then a reaction to that problem or opinion. And in this case, many people seem to think that the perception of an uncentered morality or possibly the golden and roaring 20s might have urged Schoenberg on to more of a religious concentration. And as a result, his compositions take on religious themes. Moses und Aaron is one piece that I would like you to listen to, and Jacob's Ladder. And both of these appear at Ross's audio page. I just wanted to mention that an oratorio is very similar to an opera. Usually you will see the choir standing separately, and there's usually very little interaction between the singers. So it's more like maybe some of you have seen The Messiah, so it looks a little bit more like that. Also at this time, Schoenberg unveiled his 12-tone music, or his dodecaphonic music, and I believe Ross alluded to that in the text. So if you see this term, that it just means 12-tone music. So this was unveiled in 1923, and Schoenberg really found that this discovery ordered his work, and we see a proliferation of, or a flurry of creative output in this time. Actually, this 12-tone music, and sometimes it's referred to as serial music, still exerts quite a great influence today. This was one of the first compositional techniques that I was introduced to when I was a freshman in college. So we had to write rows and inverted rows and retrograde rows. And by the way, please do not, right down here, a little disclaimer, spend a lot of time in trying to understand what all this means if you don't have a music background. It's there for those of you who want to delve into it a little bit, but it's definitely not required for this class. I wanted to just mention Ruth Crawford Seeger at this point. I do believe she makes an appearance in the text, but she was writing in the 30s and actually was a pioneer in the serialization of musical rhythm. So Schoenberg's discovery of ordering tones moved out into other musical elements, rhythm, dynamics, even articulations. And we haven't seen very many women in this book, and I just wanted to bring her name up, and so you'll be looking for her a little bit later on. A little bit of kind of a recapitulation of Schoenberg's life situation, his stabilization of his personal life in the form of his new marriage, stability in his method of composing, and his appointment to the Prussian Academy of Arts. Ross feels that Moses und Aaron was one of Schoenberg's greatest achievements, especially at this point. Please listen to this. We have clips at the Ross audio page and also at Naxos. So moving on to the end of chapter 6 and also the end of part 1, we see Berlin begin to deteriorate. Part of the problem with Berlin and its economy and its political situation was the death of Gustav Stresemann. At the same time, the stock market crash in America left difficulties in Europe as well. So we kind of had almost a global economy even in the 30s. Radical groups and radical politics were gaining momentum. We even had an artistic organization that whose politics were on the left called the Novembergruppe. Volpe was a prominent member of that group. Many of these individuals were German communists. Ross indicates that the German communists might not have offered the people too much of a more promising future than the Nazis. Both were committed to totalitarianism and shared the will to violence. Hans Eisler was another German communist. Brecht allied with Marxism and found that his politics weren't so closely aligned with those of Kurt Weill, so he started to do some collaboration with Eisler. Actually, this piece, The Yes-Sayer, is probably one of the most dark pieces that we've encountered so far, in my opinion. This was a school opera about acquiescence, or submitting your will, the individual will, to the will of the collective or the community. This opera was actually written to be rehearsed and performed in school situations. So it was actually a training in Marxist thinking. It falls under the category of agitprop, which comes from the Russian ideas of actually propaganda, which was an idea of disseminating information. It didn't have the negative connotations that propaganda has now. It was just propaganda just meant the dissemination of ideas and information. But when you combine it with agitprop, it had the effect of stirring up the emotions. I believe we have a link to The Yes-Sayer on YouTube, and it is definitely worthy of a bit of your time. And then we have The Rise and Fall of the City of Mahagoni, which was the final Brecht and Weill collaboration. This is a really interesting piece. A lot of the information from the Mahagoni Songspiel was reused. Mahagoni actually means city of nets. So if you would take a listen to The Rise and Fall of the City of Mahagoni, it's quite interesting in that the city is founded in a desert, contains all the trappings of what the Germans were seeing as Western capitalism, and I'm assuming that the city of nets would have something to do with the ensnaring properties of nets, or the ensnaring ideas of capitalism. So we move to Berlin and Lulu. Lulu is categorized as an expressionist opera. This is our final listening. This opera is composed using Schoenberg's 12-tone composition technique, although Berg did adapt it in his own quirky way. The libretto is based on two plays, Earth's Spirit and Pandora's Box. This play is actually reminiscent of what I'd call pairs of opposites. You have the power of the female sexuality, which is evident in Act 1. Lulu is pretty much in charge and is vanquishing all of her lovers. And then by the second act, her fortunes begin to change, and we see the power of the male. I think Ross alludes to it as the male brutish power, but the male power anyway. So the opera is also divided into two parts to represent these two alternating principles. And musically, the opera tends to reuse music in the second part and the third act from the music in the first part. And if you'll notice, Dr. Schoen, who actually reappears as Jack the Ripper, and the music for these two characters is very similar. So if you would please sample this opera so you can get another oral picture of 12-tone music, get a little bit familiar with the libretto and some of the ideas behind this opera. So that's it, and we're going to move into part 2 after this. I did add one more slide. I wanted to just revisit some of the basic ideas that we've encountered in our first part. Musically, we're looking at changes in rhythm, and we particularly saw this with Stravinsky. Tonality, which has been discussed in great depth in this entire part. Tonality moves to atonality, and then finally to the, instead of free atonality, the 12-tone method of Schoenberg. Dissonant harmony becomes commonplace, and we saw that begin to happen with Liszt and Wagner, and then to a great extent with Richard Strauss. We also have a period of neoclassicism, or a kind of an interest in some of the older musical forms, although the music that was composed and placed within those forms still had all of the attributes of the modernist period, with the dissonant harmony, driving rhythms, and free tonality. Jazz and folk music both exerted a strong influence on composers in Europe and in America. And then finally in our chapter for this session, we see the new objectivism and the idea of the objective and intellectual rather than the sentimental, which was a big piece of the preceding musical period of Romanticism. And then down here we have some of the aspects of the 20th century as far as technology, transportation, and communication. So if you take a look at these, I think it might help to bring together some of the basic ideas that we've been dealing with since we began our study. And as always, we have some assignments over here. The reading, these screencasts, discussion board questions, and I've created quite a few of them, so you should choose 3. And again, you can always do a personal interest topic as well. And then I have suggested listening on this slide.